Hello, in this piece we are going to be talking about evaluating extended arguments. I'll be doing a lot of talking in this presentation. Unfortunately, it isn't the type of subject that lends itself to a lot of flash or fun short video clips. Nevertheless, it is an extremely important section, if a less directly entertaining one, and so I hope you stick with it. The actual content will, at least I hope, be extremely valuable throughout both your academic careers and in life in general. There are several important keys to evaluating extended arguments. The first important thing to note, though, is that this is a skill that one builds up slowly over time. You've already been developing it. If you've ever been in an argument, read a paper critically, or engaged the world in a similar manner, you have begun developing these skills. In this presentation, we are going to talk a bit more specifically about what some of these skills are, but the most important factor involved for becoming an excellent critical thinker and writer is practice. One cannot become a great musician without playing an instrument repeatedly. One cannot become a great engineer without building things. One cannot become a great athlete without practice on the field. Likewise, one cannot become an excellent critical writer without writing, and one cannot become an excellent critical reader without reading and thinking about arguments repeatedly. If one expects that this is something that one can learn in the abstract, and then be able to immediately apply it expertly, then one's hopes are bound to be dashed, just as if one thought that one could listen to Eric Clapton give a lecture on guitar chords and then go out and rip it up on stage, one is bound to be disappointed. All skills require practice to master. As far as whether or not it is worth it for you to master this one, nobody can answer that for you, but I would urge you to think about how often you are called upon to make decisions in your life. Every day you are called upon to make choices that can make your life and the lives of those you care about better or worse. Your primary tool for making good decisions is reasoning. Reasoning well pays off tens of thousands of little ways during your lifetime, quite possibly more. When evaluating an essay, first find the thesis. Constantly keep this thesis in mind while you are reading the piece. What is the author trying to prove to her audience? You might revise what you think this thesis is as you go through the piece. The author might start off apparently making a modest claim and end up making a more drastic one. Keep in mind both what the author is implying you should believe and do, as well as what she is directly saying you should believe or do. Remember weasel words from the last presentation. In a similar way, essays can set a tone that makes implications without stating them directly. If you think that this is what the author is doing, then you want to take note of whether or not you think the author supports the implied claim as well. Second, find reasons that support the thesis. Continuously take stock of the support that the author is providing for the thesis. Also, try to keep in mind what, if anything, these other pieces of support may imply. Do any of your fallacy alarm bells go off? Or authorities cited appropriately for the issue at hand? Does the author try to force the reader into a false dilemma? And so forth. Are you being presented with arguments? And, as an active reader or listener, you should be generating objections and counterarguments as you go along. Good authors will anticipate many of these counterarguments. Again, active readers ask themselves if the counterarguments are sufficient. Can they be countered themselves? Most importantly, critical readers look for counterarguments even when the piece they are reading supports their own point of view. Just because a piece supports a view you hold does not mean that it does so for good reasons. A person might agree with your conclusions but do so for very bad reasons. An extreme example might be somebody who agrees with you about who to vote for president, not because they agree with your meticulous research about politics and the economy, but because they believe in numerology, and the numerological value for the candidate's last name you favor happens to be a good number according to this person's numerological argument. In such a case, you agree with who the person wants people to vote for, but you think that this person has very bad reasons, and you should be critical of those reasons. This person isn't a good representative of why a rational person should vote for your candidate. Academic papers tend to have very high standards of writing in that they try very hard to be objective, use a neutral tone, make verifying research easy, and only include relevant information. or at least try to. Unfortunately, this is often very dry reading. Even newspapers have moved away from drier journalistic reporting to more sensationalized reporting. So one important job when reading or listening to extended arguments is to try to eliminate non sequiturs and irrelevant information. When writing yourself, whether you include these sorts of elements depends upon your audience, but you should always be aware that you are putting irrelevant information in when you do. You should never be fooling yourself. When writing academic papers for classes, you should typically be trying to eliminate irrelevant information. Some exceptions may be if you are asked to write a moving speech for a speech class, or persuasive speech, or if you are writing fiction. Identifying evidence. As the author argues for her position, she will provide evidence or support for her conclusions. That is to say, she will provide reasons for believing as she does. Just some types of evidence may be authority. Remember, not all appeals to authority are fallacious. Personal experience. This could be the author's experience, anecdotal, personal anecdotes. Anecdotal interviews. Appeals to the reader's experience. The author could use generally accepted facts, or appeal to common sense. Or the author might entreat the reader to do simple experiment, or point out readily available observational information. And of course, there are plenty of other kinds of evidence as well. We have spent a good deal of time with appeals to authority in previous presentations, so we'll not rehash all of that here. Suffice it to say that you need to make sure that authorities are of the right kind, that the issue is one that can be settled by authority, that authorities are in general agreement, and so on. The value of authority is also not digital. That is to say, authorities are not either of ultimate value or valueless. In some cases, authorities may be of some value, but not settle the issue. One of the types of evidence to be most wary of are appeals to personal experience. Appeals to personal experience are prone to many errors. First, because memory is subject to error, and false memories easily replace true ones. Further, what we perceive is often tainted by what we expect to perceive. We have seen this in more detail in the section regarding psychological impediments to good reasoning, and also the Brain Games video. In the case of anecdotal evidence given by the author, or even attributed to others, one has to be careful that it is true. In scientific studies, people's reports about what they have seen are carefully tallied. But when politicians give speeches, they often tell tales of people that they have met who apparently don't exist upon further investigation. Even harder to verify are the anecdotes told about people who are told by somebody else who's repeating that story. In other words, second-hand stories. When the appeal is to the reader's own personal experience, one still has to be aware of the weaknesses inherent in personal experience. Is the author trying to get you to make a wide sweeping judgment based on limited experience? For example, are you supposed to make a judgment regarding the country based on something that likely happened in your area? The common experiences of an audience of a particular piece of writing are not necessarily the average experiences of the population as a whole. Remember that the author knows the audience she is speaking to, and this audience may have a set of experiences to appeal to that do not apply to the whole group of people that the piece's thesis is attempting to draw a conclusion about. Again, appeals to experience are some of the weakest types of appeals one can make. Appeals to common sense are just as dangerous. The brain is an organ that developed to make judgments about matters and circumstances that have largely changed in modern environments. Our intuitions are not always correct. One way to see this is to see how easily taken in we are by optical illusions. These illusions are very useful for maneuvering in 3D space in most environments. But if you actually want to know the truth, suppose say you were designing optical sensors and you want to know the true color of an object, you better not let common sense trump what physical science of optics is telling you about the world. Consider, it is common sense that tells us that the Earth is flat. It looks flat. It took a lot of work to discover that it was round. Common sense tells us the Earth stays still and the stars and the sun and planets move around us. It sure seems like they circle around us. It looks like it, and it doesn't feel like we're moving. It takes a relatively advanced and abstract understanding of physics to understand why not. Common sense tells us that heavier objects would fall faster than lighter ones. They feel like they're being pulled down harder. Single demonstrations by Galileo showing that heavy and light objects fall at the same speed were not enough to convince many people because the intuition was so strong. Common sense tells us that the more people who see an accident, the more likely one is to get help. But the bystander effect lets us know that when fewer people are present, one of them is more likely to call for help than when lots of them are present. Further, in test after test, people do not think that the number of people around them has anything to do with their decision to call for help, showing just how bad our introspection into our own psychologies is. Common sense tells us that the set of all odd numbers plus the set of all even numbers is larger than the set of all odd numbers alone. But it is not. Infinites are very counterintuitive. Common sense tells us that the chair you are sitting in and the keyboard you are typing on are solid objects. Modern physics tells us that they are almost entirely empty space. And this picture doesn't do the case justice. If this were proportional to an atom, if you read the text here, that black dot would be at the center of a football field, in fact larger than the stadium, with that black dot as the nucleus in the center and the electrons orbiting it. Everything else is empty space. We could give example after example. When it comes to the ultimate nature of reality, common sense steers us wrong time after time. It takes careful analysis, research, and experimentation to make headway in getting past what common sense tells us. The upshot of all this is, depending on what the piece is about, appeals to common sense may be of questionable value. This does not mean that they can be dismissed outright, but whenever one realizes that one is relying on what is perceived as common sense, one should ask if that common sense can be further defended. Generally accepted facts can be very useful shortcuts. One does not need to specifically state that dogs are animals, or that animals need to eat, or that people need sleep to function, or millions of other facts that we rely upon all the time. If people had to state every relevant detail in everything they wrote, papers would be enormously long. Nevertheless, one wants to be careful here too. Many commonly held beliefs people take to be facts, are in fact in error. Nevertheless, they are commonly repeated. Some of these are deliberately repeated by people who know better for political or social reasons, and then repeated by others out of error. Others are just errors that continue. Here are some examples. I'm just going to give you a few examples, but the point of all of this is that generally accepted facts can often be wrong. 1 year is all the time that we only use 10% of our brain. Not true, not close. You won't find a neurologist saying this, but you hear it repeated so often on television shows and movies that many people think that it's a scientific fact. The idea that you can't prove a negative is nonsense. People should know better since they prove negatives all the time. They do so in math class. They do so in balancing their checkbooks. In fact, the very statement you can't prove a negative is itself a negative statement. So if you were ever to prove that that statement were true, it would have to be false. In other words, it contains an inherent contradiction. Many people believe that gum stays in your digestive tract for years. Swallowing gum certainly isn't good for you, but it doesn't get stuck in your system. It has often been repeated deliberately by religious groups, both that Darwin recanted his beliefs on his deathbed and that Einstein was religious. Neither is true. I'm not promoting or arguing against the idea of God here, but this is an example of a belief deliberately repeated by some people who knew better, then repeated even more often by people who did not know better. The result is now that you still hear it said that Einstein believed in God on news shows and in debates, even though he explicitly said, and this is a quote, "It was, of course, a lie what you heard about my religious convictions, a lie which is being systematically repeated. I do not believe in a personal God, and I have never denied this, but have expressed it clearly. If something is in me which can be called religious, then it is my unbounded admiration for the structure of the world so far as science can reveal it." And there was no evidence that Darwin changed his views. In fact, he became more of a physicalist or materialist as time went on. The person who originated the claim that he did was somebody who visited him once then didn't say anything until quite a while after he died. Had Darwin changed his mind, his family, not a stranger, would have been the first to know and to say something about it. And Darwin would have told them first, since it was a source of embarrassment to them and he hated causing them trouble. And he would have been quite vocal about it. Again, the point here isn't anything to do about religion. It is just that these two examples come up so often, especially in philosophy courses. And they show that oftentimes beliefs can be perpetuated and taken to be common truths that anyone can appeal to because everybody knows they're true, even though they turn out to be false. Here are just a few more to really drive the point home. Reading in bad light is not bad for your eyes. Cats don't kill babies by taking their breath. Cracking one's knuckles doesn't cause arthritis. Eating chocolate does not make acne worse, except insofar as sugar can, but there's nothing special about chocolate. You do not lose most of your body heat through your head. You should not feed a cold, starve a fever. Carrots have lots of health benefits, but they are not going to give you great eyesight. Your eyes do need beta-carotene, but this is a vitamin plentiful in plenty of foods. Sugar isn't good for anybody, but it doesn't make children hyper. Caffeine does not stunt your growth. And vitamin C does not cure the common cold. And there's a link to this information at the bottom. Adding relevant information and reasons to the argument you have read. As we have said, not everything can be mentioned in an argument. Some background information is assumed. Think about what information is being assumed. Is any of it questionable? Would any of it contradict any of the arguer's reasoning? Sometimes the arguer might hold an inconsistent or contradictory opinion without even realizing it. Or sometimes the reasoning or implication of the arguments or sub-arguments would have other implications or consequences that, though not directly contradictory to the thesis, the author would be unwilling to swallow. This doesn't disprove the thesis, but it shows that the author is being inconsistent and would have to let one of her two positions go. You should also consider tone and emotive language. We are persuaded by excellent writers and good writing. Emotive writing can also help to persuade us. Excellent writers who are intending to persuade us, rather than only investigate the truth, use both of these facts to their advantage. The more aware you are of tone and emotive use of language, the more you can guard against manipulation by irrelevant factors extraneous to the arguments. The book suggests circling such words and underlining them. One thing you might do is highlight such words with different colored highlighters. This is probably not a practice you'll continue for years and years, while jotting down notes about counter-arguments, potential objections, weaknesses, and implications will always be useful. But it is helpful to do this for a while so that you get the feel for the presence of emotive language. Also, it is useful to continue to do occasionally, even once you become masterful at this, especially when there are egregious examples of this kind of manipulation. This book does do a good job of pointing out that ethical principles, and even issues such as matters of beauty and so forth, are not necessarily subjective. This is what philosophers spend so much time arguing about. So I am going to make a bit of a distinction here. Empirical facts. These are facts that can be confirmed through the senses, scientific sorts of facts, measurable. Then there are facts of reason, rationalist. These are truths that can be determined purely by a relationship of concepts. We have talked a bit about this. Something might be a tautology, necessarily true. Contradictory, necessarily false. You might want to know if one concept is contained within another. For example, knowing that the concept of a square is a polygon with 4 sides with equal length and 4 interior angles of 90 degrees each, and knowing that a rectangle is a concept of a 4-sided polygon with sides of any length, so long as each interior angle is 90 degrees, you can determine that a square is a special type of rectangle. You can determine this through analyzing the concepts alone. You don't have to go out and examine thousands of squares and confirm that they are all also rectangles. Value claims. First, there's no claim that these are metaphysically different kinds of facts philosophically. Different philosophers, depending on their ethical theories and metaphysical views, for example, might place ethical value claims as empirical facts or facts of reason. That goes beyond our scope for now. I have these separated out for a different reason. First, there are all sorts of value claims. One might claim that one thing tastes better than another, or is more attractive than another. When looking at value claims, the first thing to ask is whether or not the author is trying to make a purely subjective assertion. If the author is trying to make a purely subjective assertion, simply saying something like, "I like strawberry ice cream better than chocolate," then there probably isn't much to evaluate. If the author is merely saying that it is her own personal preference, then unless you're going to make an argument that the author's preferences are in some way confused, or that the author is misrepresenting her preferences, there isn't much more to say. The fact that the author prefers something isn't an argument that it is better or that other people should. But usually, purely subjective claims are not the source of arguments that one needs to evaluate. Typically, if one is evaluating a value claim in an extended argument, it is because the author is trying to convince the reader or listener that the value claim is correct in some way. If this is the case, then the author is usually saying that there is at least some objective element to the value claim. The most common value claims of this sort are moral value claims. We are very concerned about doing the right thing. As a society, we spend a tremendous amount of time debating not only the direct effects of policies, but whether or not those policies are in fact morally good ones. The very fact that we are presenting arguments about them and think that we can give arguments means that we are accepting, at that point, that they are not purely subjective, even if they may have subjective elements. Now, we can't go into the kinds of detail here that we would for an ethics course, but when evaluating moral claims, what one has to consider is on what sort of moral basis the arguer is holding these claims. Remember that nobody is going to argue for their ethical worldview as a whole when writing a paper arguing for a particular policy. There are space restraints, time restraints, and restraints on the amount of patience of the reader. If I wanted to argue against a bill that would allow a company to pollute more, for example, I probably wouldn't start off writing a 500-page thesis defending an ethical framework in which to place the issue of industrial pollution. By reading the argument, we can get an idea for the type of moral framework an author is making a moral claim under. Here are some basic types. Is it a consequentialist type morality? That is to say, is the arguer attempting to say that the issue in question is moral or immoral issue because of the consequences that will result? If so, then looking at the potential or likely consequences of an issue is a place to focus on if your aim is to undermine the author's arguments under her own ethical theory. So, is the argument concerned with whether or not something will cause harm to others, people or animals, or even other things one might care about, such as collective intellectual progress, or art, or preservation of nature? The important thing to note is that the consequentialist arguments are ultimately concerned with what the ultimate outcome will be. When analyzing these claims, then, one needs to ask if an author's analysis of possible goods and harms is accurate, and if so, do they leave out goods or harms? Are they looking long-term enough? Do they consider everybody affected? And do they seem to care about everybody affected, and so forth? Next are principle-based arguments. Principle-based arguments don't argue that there are necessarily good or bad consequences as something is done or not done, but rather that doing or not doing this thing falls into line with a moral principle. So a consequentialist argument against gun control, sometimes given by gun advocates, is that they think that crime rates would go up if people didn't have guns to defend themselves with. A non-consequentialist, principle-based argument they give is that restrictions on guns violates a basic right. In other words, maintaining that right has at least some value independent of any consequences associated with it. One might think that there are principles to keep promises, not because of good results, but because promises should be kept. Or that killing is always wrong, not because killing always causes more harm than good, but because of a principle of the sanctity of life. The important thing to note is that if somebody is making a principle-based appeal, counter-arguments that appeal to bad consequences are going to be of limited value to that person. If the person holds the principle outweighs any consequences, then consequences are irrelevant, and one would then need to either argue that holding that principle is problematic, or that there are some problems with that principle itself. If one holds simply that some principles have value in addition to consequences, then positive or negative enough consequences might override that principle. For example, should one never break a promise? What if breaking the promise were the only way to stop a nuclear bomb from going off in the middle of New York City? If the principle was absolute, then one should not break the promise based on negative consequences of the bomb. If the principle just has moral weight, then enough weight in terms of negative consequences should outweigh it. The next thing I listed here is absolute rules. Often religious rules such as the Ten Commandments or religious edicts and so forth fall under this category. This would be a subclass of principles, but I listed it separately because many types of ethical principles are often more general and argued for systematically. Arguments that depend upon appeal to a religious rule or interpretation, however, are often in danger of being circular, or at the very least, of being convincing only to an audience that already agrees with the arguer. If, for example, one makes a lengthy argument that premarital sex is wrong by citing biblical passages that simply state that premarital sex is wrong, this argument will do nothing to convince people who do not believe that religious rule or who do not believe in that particular religious interpretation. The argument could go on to defend why this is the best interpretation in order to try to convince people, to convince those who agree, for example, that the Bible is right in all things but believe in a different interpretation. But again, one should notice the limit on those who it can convince. In order to convince others, one would need an argument that one should logically accept that the Bible is right in all things, or at least this. And that would be a lengthy treatise on religion that would likely go beyond the argument or paper that the author was giving. The point is that arguments of the form X is wrong because Y says it's wrong tend to be unconvincing to anybody who doesn't already believe the authority of Y. If, on the other hand, Y is something very general that many people believe, such as causing harm is bad, then one can argue that many different sorts of things might be wrong by appealing to the bad consequences that they might have. Likewise, if Y is a principle that is defended not on authority but on an argument, that argument can be given, although this might be a longer sort of argument or even a long treatise. Or often such principles are sufficiently general that people accept them to one degree or another, such as we should keep our promises. So that was a lot, so I thought I would just recap some of what we've said about value claims. The purpose of this was not to confuse you by introducing a lot of new terms to you. The purpose was to show you how you might approach evaluating the moral claims others might make. So, here are the main points to take away from all that. Usually people don't spend a lot of time arguing over ethical claims they believe are completely subjective. When people make ethical arguments, they do so within the context of a particular ethical theory. They might not know or even have a name for their theory, but they have at least a context for evaluating ethical claims themselves. In order to evaluate the reasoning of the author within her own framework, one has to try to understand what kind of criteria she is using. The two major types of ethical criteria are consequential, things are good or bad because of what will result from them, and principle-based, things are good or bad, at least some degree, independent of consequences. Ethical commands are a subset of this. They run a danger of appealing to an authority that might severely limit the audience that the arguer can influence. Irony. Many times authors will argue ironically. This is making an argument that one doesn't actually support in an attempt to try to show how silly the other side is. It is arguing for the opposite of what one actually believes. It is different from playing devil's advocate, because when playing devil's advocate, one is trying to defend an opposing position to the best of one's ability. One is not giving silly or bad arguments. It is also different from the straw man or tilting at windmills fallacy. It is different from this fallacy because in the case of irony, the author does not intend that the argument be seen as a real argument that the opponent is actually making. There is no genuine attempt to fool anybody. Instead, irony tends to be used to do two major things, although it can likely be used to do more. It can be used to draw attention to something, often something horrible that is being ignored. This was the case with the Jonathan Swift argument used in the book, where it was proposed that the hungry poor raise children for food. It can be used as a type of reductio ad absurdum in an attempt to show that acting or reasoning as one's opponent does results in something silly. Irony is usually done with humor. This makes a particularly effective tool for maintaining the reader's attention, winning favor, and propagating from person to person. Here's an example of irony for you to click on from the Colbert report. It is more towards the end. There's a little bit of setup. As always, you can pause at the bottom of the screen. I'll give you a 5 count to do so. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. As an active reader, you should take note of responses and counterarguments. Note possible counterarguments and responses while you are reading. These might attack the truth value of the premises the arguer is using, or they might attack the reasoning of the piece. Try not to only think of responses or objections or counterarguments, but try to also think about how the author might respond to those objections. With practice, you develop the ability to construct a kind of dialogue in your head where you propose arguments and anticipate what might be said in objection to them. It is often a good idea to write down possible objections, whether in separate notes or in the margins of the text, especially when reading academic work. You can then come back to these possible objections and flesh them out later. Here are some reasoning hints and tricks. When looking at an author's argument, get into the habit of asking yourself some questions to test out the argument. Can the argument be applied to itself? This isn't always relevant, but when it is, it can really be important. Remember a while ago we talked about the idea that many people believe that you can't prove a negative, but this is itself a negative statement. The universal claim that is being made by the proposition that you can't prove a negative cannot be applied to itself, which is a major problem. This is what's known as a self-defeating argument. Try to take the argument to the extreme. If the author's argument allows for it, see what happens when you test the argument with extreme cases. These might be hypothetical. Now you want to be careful that you don't fall into a slippery slope fallacy. If the argument has a problem with extremes, the next question to ask is whether or not the arguer has a reasonable stopping place, or whether her principles force her all the way down into a real slippery slope, or whether your slippery slope argument would be a fallacy. Do any of the sub-arguments or premises require that overall conclusion be true in order to work? Sometimes this happens in a subtle and roundabout way. Checking for this is a way of checking for circular reasoning or begging the question. Try to determine what pieces of evidence or reasoning are most important to the argument. Mentally eliminate or change some of them to see how that affects the argument for you. This could give you an idea of where the real linchpins of the argument are. You can then focus more of your attention on investigating whether or not the justifications or pieces of evidence that the author provides for those pieces of reasoning are as reasonable as they are presented to be. So Occam's razor, sometimes called the principle of parsimony, is a very important and useful tool of reasoning, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Occam's razor is often phrased in the following way: entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. A more common though less precise way of stating it is that the simpler solution is more commonly the correct one. In other words, theory should posit as few types of things, entities, as possible. But one has to be careful. Multiple entities can be squeezed into one. Entity here doesn't mean being or living thing, it means concepts or assumptions as well. How many new things do you have to posit about the world for the theory? For example, you are on the plains of Texas at midnight. It's pitch black. You hear hoofbeats coming toward you. What is it? There's a saying in medicine that exemplifies this principle. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. But why? Both horses and zebras are going to sound about the same running. Let's say you can't tell the difference by the sound. What reason do you have to believe it's a horse and not a zebra? Occam's razor helps justify your position. For the hoofbeats to be a horse, it could be a wild horse or one of the thousands around the area that escaped in any number of ways. To be a zebra, you have to posit a zoo or somebody who keeps a rare and exotic animal nearby, and that this animal, which is of a type that people are likely to take especially good care of, somehow escaped. The zebra hypothesis, though, fits the facts of the hoofbeats equally well, but it's much less likely to be true. Of course, keep in mind that this is a principle. Sometimes the more complex explanation is true. Sometimes the hoofbeats really are from a zebra. Another note about multiplying entities. Suppose that you hear multiple hoofbeats. You could hypothesize a herd of horses, or you could hypothesize a giant centipede-type horse with 100 legs. Occam's razor does not suggest you should imagine one centipede-type horse with 100 legs because it is only one entity. The issue is how many assumptions you are making. There are lots of hidden assumptions involved in the existence of a centihorse, and far fewer in the idea of several horses running by. Below is a link to a very short video explaining the principle of Occam's razor in more detail. It is very worth watching. I will count down from 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Some common errors to watch out for. We have already talked a lot about fallacies, so I won't rehash all that here. But some of the following are extended mistakes that are repeated time and time again. The is-ought gap. This error occurs when somebody argues that because something is the case, it morally ought to be the case as well. People often slip from arguing about what we should do, or what is the right thing to do, to what we will do, or what has been done. One special version of this is confusing what is legal with what is moral. Oftentimes, people will begin arguing about what the right thing to do is, and then slide into arguing what is or what is not against the law. But unless you also argue that the laws are always moral, arguing about what is legal is of limited value. Usually the arguers know the legal status, but are interested in the morality of the issue. So, one might argue about the morality of copying music on the internet, for example. People who do this already know it is against the law. If one is going to take the route of arguing about the law, this could be relevant, but not to point out the obvious that it's against the law, but to make the further argument that we generally have a moral duty to obey the law. It would then be up to the person defending the other side of the argument to either argue that we have no such duty, or that we have no such duty in this particular case, or that this duty is outweighed by other moral considerations. Another special version of this, which is perhaps even more common, is to argue that something is natural and therefore it is moral. In other words, that since something isn't the way things are or currently are, that it ought not be the way they are. Plenty of things are unnatural that are good in the sense of good for us. Houses, clothes, agriculture, vaccines, surgery, writing, language, and so forth. Also, lots of things are unnatural and presumably morally good, such as building houses for others, or creating charities, and so forth. Plenty of natural things are bad in the sense of bad for us: smallpox, infections, freezing in the cold, heat stroke in extreme heat, and so on. And presumably plenty of these things are also morally bad. That is to say, if we saw somebody dying of an infection and could save this person, it would be morally wrong not to do so, simply because the infection was natural and the surgery to save the person was unnatural. If you look for it, you will see this version of the is-ought fallacy appearing all the time. Of course, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be wary of putting synthetic things in our bodies. There are reasons why we have huge batteries of tests before chemicals are approved for human consumption, and even then things go wrong. The fallacy isn't the idea that unnatural things have to be good for you, only the idea that somehow being natural is the same thing as being good. A bit about necessary and sufficient conditions. When you find that an author makes a mistake, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because a thesis contains a bad argument, that doesn't mean that the entire thesis is undermined. Whether it is or not depends upon how necessary that argument was in terms of giving support for that thesis. When giving arguments, people often give lots of reasons for accepting the conclusions they're arguing for. Sometimes each of these reasons adds strength or weight to accepting the conclusion. If that is the case, then undermining one of these arguments only lessens the weight in favor of accepting that conclusion. It doesn't undermine the whole thing. For example, suppose that somebody was arguing that the death penalty was a good thing because it saves money and because it makes society safer because it deters other murderers. I'm not actually arguing for this one way or another, I'm just using this as an example. Now suppose, as a counter-argument, you show that statistics prove that it actually costs more money to execute a person than it does to keep that person in prison for life. What you did was undermine one of the reasons given for supporting the death penalty. But the two given reasons were independent of each other. In order to fully undermine the argument, you would either need to show that whatever reasoning I gave in an attempt to show that using the death penalty deterred other murders was faulty, or that this consideration is outweighed by other considerations, perhaps other harms, or because the death penalty violates other moral principles. The point here isn't anything to do with the death penalty. The point is that when a thesis has two or more independent means of support, showing that one is faulty doesn't undermine all other means or arguments in favor of the position. Necessary conditions. On the other hand, sometimes conditions are necessary. If this is the case, then showing that an argument doesn't meet a necessary condition is enough to show that the whole thesis fails. For example, suppose that we are oath-bound only to pass constitutional laws. If that were the case, then showing that a law is inadvisable because it might have certain bad consequences only counts against passing that law. After all, it might have good consequences too. But if it was shown that it was unconstitutional, and if we took our oath seriously, that would be enough to show that we should not pass the law, regardless of any other arguments in favor of it. Sufficient conditions. Other conditions are sufficient. If there is a sufficient condition, then that means that having that condition met is all that is needed to show that a conclusion is true. For example, suppose that somebody is on trial for murder. Showing that this person didn't have motive, or that somebody else had a greater motive and access, and that the evidence fit better, would all count towards finding that person not guilty. Those conditions just count in favor of the not guilty argument. However, finding out that the supposed victim is actually alive and vacationing in Hawaii is a sufficient condition to find the person innocent. It doesn't matter at that point how many bloodstains there are and how much DNA evidence there is, or how strong the person's motive to commit the murder is. If it turns out that the supposed victim isn't in fact dead, then the argument for finding somebody guilty of murdering that person goes out the window. Sufficient condition. Now let's talk about some note-taking methods you can apply while reading. The margin note and summary method. The margin note and summary method has 4 steps as outlined in Cavender-Cahane's book. First, read the material to be summarized. Next, read it again. This time mark the important passages with an indication of their content written in the margin. The first reading allows you to have a general idea of what to look for and an overall appreciation for where the piece is going and what might be important. It also gives you the ability to do the second step more accurately. Third, use the notes in the margin to construct a summary of the passage, indicating which of the noted statements are premises and which are conclusions. This reveals the structure of the passage's argument. Finally, evaluate the essay by evaluating your own summary. Make sure to compare your summary with the actual text frequently to make sure that there are no significant or important discrepancies between the two. The Curry method. Here is a method I often use. I did this countless times for difficult papers in philosophy classes. It is especially useful when dealing with papers and arguments where the language might be a barrier. That is to say, with pieces that were written long enough ago for the linguistic style to be a barrier, or pieces written with especially complex sentences or unfamiliar words. Step 1. Number all the paragraphs. Step 2. Read the piece through quickly. Step 3. On a separate piece of paper, or more likely in a separate document file on a laptop computer or some such, Read each paragraph and then write down, next to the corresponding number, what you think the paragraph says in your own words. There is an art to this. You don't want to include everything. Sometimes the original paragraph will contain lengthy examples that you can explain more quickly, so long as you do so in a way that is thorough to yourself. But you need to 1. Get all the important points in, 2. Make sure you can understand it, and 3. Make sure you would be able to understand it when you go back to your notes later. When you can, use your own examples to illustrate the point. Don't just copy the author's. Also, your own notes for a paragraph may sometimes be longer than the paragraph itself. Sometimes the author may use concepts, ideas, and language that you are not familiar with. You may need to explain these. Sometimes your summary of a paragraph may be more than one paragraph long. Sometimes your summary of a very long paragraph may only be a sentence or two. But you should expect to write a lot with this method. It is good writing practice. Also important, this is a good place to put in potential objections and counter-arguments you may have, which is another reason why this may get long. Put in your potential objections. To keep your asides separate from your summary, put them in brackets and in bold. Step 4. After going through the whole piece, write a brief summary that you put at the top, outlining the basic thesis and arguments of the piece. Then write a paragraph or two expressing your reservations or objections or possible weaknesses of the piece. Once you finish, you not only likely have a very thorough understanding of the piece, but you have a terrific set of notes and the beginnings of any kind of assignment that might involve these pieces. This method is a lot of work, and you don't necessarily need to do it for very small, easy readings. But if you have any difficulty at all with a piece, I can tell you from experience that it has been of tremendous help to me. What is more, it is a method that gives you practice writing, and that is very useful. This is something that is difficult to state too often. People clarify their own thoughts in the process of writing about them. Authors don't necessarily know everything they are going to say when they sit down to write a piece. They sit down, and when they get up, their understanding is greater than when it was before because they have organized their thoughts. Thinking on the page is extremely valuable. Writing is not just something you should do when you have an assignment to turn in. This is a method of thinking in an organized manner, as well as a way of recording your thoughts so that you can retrieve them more easily later on. Okay, let's round things out by looking at a couple of examples from the book. These are not the best examples of evaluating extended arguments because they're only a paragraph or so long, but they might give you an idea of the kinds of things to look for. If you're using the Kahane book, this is question 2 from exercise 8-1. What is wrong with a little censorship? Until quite recently, all sorts of things were censored in American society. There were very strict rules about what you could show on television and in movies, and what you could describe in books, and what you could reproduce in magazines. Were we worse off then? There are plenty of reasons to support government censorship when it comes to depictions of sex and violence. For one thing, it would encourage the entertainment industry to turn out material that is richer erotically. Another reason to support government censorship is that it would help temper the extraordinary brutality of popular culture. Society has an interest in protecting free speech and the circulation of ideas. It also has an interest in protecting the moral sensibility of its citizens, especially the young. Freedom without morality degenerates into servitude and libertarianage. Which is why judicious government censorship is not the enemy of freedom, but its guarantor. And there's a link to the whole Kimball piece at the bottom. Okay, so let's look at this. What is the thesis? There's nothing wrong with censorship. The author uses the word little here. What kind of censorship is he talking about? From the context, it becomes clear that at the very least, he's talking about censorship of sexual material and violent material. How little is the amount of censorship? That isn't clear. What is his support? Appeal to tradition. This is how things have been done. Until quite recently, all sorts of things have been censored, he says. There's a vague rhetorical question. Were we worse off then? Well, worse off in what way and by what causes? Also, when is then? What years is he referring to? He thinks that censoring the entertainment industry will cause them to produce material that is richer erotically. But what does this mean? And is this a personal preference of his? what he finds erotic. Is it something objective? This bears investigation. He also says that it would help temper the brutality of popular culture. In just this information cited here, there isn't much evidence given, but remember that not everything is in this piece is stated. Is popular culture violent? Certainly we can think of a lot of violent television and movies. Has it been getting worse, though? We might need to identify the ways in which we mean better and worse. Are we talking about the number of deaths, or the graphic depiction of those deaths in the sense of gore, or whether or not brutality is considered an acceptable way of resolving issues? Once spelled out, we need to look at the past to examine where things have changed and in which direction. In old westerns, for example, gunfights were a common method of resolving disputes, but they were not very bloody at all, and they did not seem very realistic. What is important here and why? At the end, the author makes an even stronger claim, saying that somehow censorship not only is not an enemy of freedom, but actually helps guarantee it. Is this ever argued for in the piece? Admittedly, it's a bit hard for you to judge this, since we have only seen a segment of the piece. If you want, you can read the whole thing. The link is provided. From question 4. In response to outbreaks of violence on college campuses, gun advocates are lobbying colleges and universities to permit students to carry guns on campus. Although they insist that gun-toting students would discourage mass killers and thus make campuses safer, they are wrong. Undergraduates are too young to handle firearms responsibly and are more likely to shoot each other in the heat of an argument than a mass murderer, a phenomenon as rare as the dodo bird. Even if a killer did show up and students tried to gun him or her down, the police would have a hard time sorting out the students from the gunmen. Besides, there are fewer than 20 homicides on campus a year, so colleges would hardly be justified in giving thousands of students the right to tote guns. Okay, let's give analysis of this one a shot. What is the thesis? That allowing or encouraging students to carry guns on campus in order to deter mass shootings would be a mistake. What are the evidence and arguments given? Claim: undergraduates are too young to handle firearms responsibly. Is there evidence to show that this is true? Research: is this an appeal to common sense or common knowledge? If so, is it reliable? Claim: they are more likely to shoot each other in the heat of an argument than a mass murderer. This is both an appeal to common sense, the idea that if people get angry and they have guns handy they might use them, and this seems sensible, though we should be wary of common sense opinions and try to find actual scientific evidence if it's available. The other part is an argument that mass shootings are so rare that deterring one by having guns on campus is going to be highly unlikely. Now, one might be tempted to claim that there's a bad analogy in here as well, comparing the rarity of mass shootings to the rarity of a dodo bird. The dodo bird, after all, is extinct, and mass shootings, unfortunately, are anything but. But the author is using hyperbole here to make a point. He isn't intending anybody to actually believe that mass shootings didn't occur. His point is that they are rare. And they are. How rare? Well, it's time to look at a statistic. He does give one: less than 20 homicides on campuses a year. So that's not extinct, but it is rare. So he's giving the argument that the likelihood of averting a crisis like a mass shooting is going to be far more rare than the likelihood of some sort of gun violence or gun accident occurring if thousands of students started carrying guns around on campus. Finally, he gives the argument that even if there was a mass shooting and gun-toting students tried to stop them, that when trained police officers arrived, they wouldn't be able to tell the good guys from the bad guys. This argument seems reasonable on the surface. In the heat of the moment, anybody without a uniform carrying a gun may seem like the enemy. Of course, this is just an initial impression. Analysis or evidence may prove cursory reasoning wrong. So what do you think of this overall argument? Okay, well, that about wraps up this presentation. The last thing I would like to say is that when evaluating a piece, it is a perfectly legitimate stance to withhold judgment. It isn't always advisable to form an opinion right away. You might not feel you have enough information. It is perfectly reasonable to think and refrain from forming an opinion while one continues to investigate. And when one does form an opinion, one should always be ready to revise it if the grounds for holding that opinion change. Until next time.